They called him Yaponets, the Japanese, because of his Asian features and his silent, calculating nature. In the chaos of post-Soviet Moscow, where violence was currency and loyalty was fiction, Yaponets became a legend by never saying more than necessary and never leaving witnesses alive. Moscow, USSR, 1962. Vyacheslav Leontyev was born into a Soviet Union that was simultaneously powerful and rotting from within. Brezhnev's stagnation era meant economic decline masked by propaganda, corruption becoming systematic, and a society where official ideology and actual reality existed in separate universes. Young Vyacheslav grew up in this duality, learning early that survival required understanding both the official rules and the real ones. His Asian features, likely from mixed ancestry common in Russia's vast geography, earned him the nickname Yaponets, the Japanese, from childhood. In Soviet Moscow, where ethnic Russians dominated and difference invited mockery, the nickname could have been an insult. But Vyacheslav made it something else. An identity, a brand, a reputation that would eventually be whispered with fear rather than derision. The family was working class, neither privileged nor destitute. His father worked in a factory, his mother in Soviet bureaucracy, and they provided the basics of Soviet life. Cramped apartment, occasional luxuries when connections allowed, and the constant navigation of shortage economy where what you knew mattered more than money. Vyacheslav watched his parents survive through informal networks, favors traded, and the understanding that official channels rarely provided what families needed. Soviet childhood in the 1970s meant young pioneers, communist ideology in schools, and a society that preached equality while practicing privilege for party members. Vyacheslav saw the contradictions: officials living well while ordinary citizens queued for hours, stores empty except for those with connections, and the constant gap between propaganda and reality. These lessons created cynicism about authority and recognition that real power existed outside official structures. By his teenage years, Vyacheslav was already operating in Moscow's shadow economy. The informal markets, black market goods, and small-scale hustles that everyone participated in because official economy couldn't provide basic needs. He wasn't a criminal yet, everyone bought and sold unofficially in Soviet Union, but he was learning the fundamentals. How to find what people wanted, how to connect buyers with sellers, and how to profit from scarcity. His personality was distinctive even then. Vyacheslav was quiet, observant, and strategic rather than impulsive. While other young men were loud and aggressive, Vyacheslav watched and calculated. His Asian features gave him an exotic, mysterious quality that he cultivated deliberately. The nickname Yaponets became his identity. Mysterious, foreign, different. And in Moscow's criminal underworld that was forming beneath Soviet surface, difference could be power if deployed correctly. The mid-1980s brought Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness, that were supposed to save Soviet Union but instead accelerated its collapse. For ordinary Soviets, these reforms meant chaos. Economic systems breaking down, authority structures crumbling, and uncertainty about what would replace the old order. But for young criminals like Vyacheslav Leontyev, chaos meant opportunity. As Soviet economy collapsed, informal markets exploded. Goods disappeared from official stores and appeared in underground markets where prices were negotiated and fortunes could be made. Vyacheslav, already experienced in shadow economy, expanded operations dramatically. He wasn't just trading cigarettes and Western goods anymore. He was moving larger quantities, establishing distribution networks, and building what would become a criminal organization. The KGB and militia, Soviet police, were losing control. The institutions that had maintained order through fear and omnipresent surveillance were weakening. Officers were demoralized, corruption was increasing, and attention was divided between preventing crime and managing political chaos. For criminals, this meant unprecedented freedom to operate. Vyacheslav took full advantage, expanding operations while law enforcement was distracted. But Soviet collapse also meant violence was increasing. Different criminal groups were fighting over territory and opportunities. The thieves-in-law, Vori v. Zakon, Soviet Union's traditional criminal hierarchy, were being challenged by new, younger criminals who didn't respect old codes. Vyacheslav existed between these worlds. Too young to be traditional vor, but smart enough to learn from them while building something new. His approach was strategic rather than just violent. Vyacheslav understood that in chaos, organization beats disorder. He built structures when others operated chaotically. He planned long-term when others grabbed immediate profits. And crucially, he built relationships with both traditional criminals and emerging new generation. This positioning allowed Vyacheslav to navigate the violent chaos of late Soviet criminal world without being destroyed by it. The nickname Yaponets took on new meaning during this period. Vyacheslav's calm, calculated approach reminded people of stereotypes about Asian discipline and patience. His silence became legendary. He'd sit through meetings barely speaking, letting others talk while he observed and calculated. When he did speak, people listened because words from Yaponets were rare and usually important. This cultivated mystique made him more intimidating than louder, more obviously violent criminals. August 1991. The failed coup against Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin standing on a tank, and the final collapse of Soviet Union created a moment of absolute chaos. The old system died, the new system hadn't been born yet, and in that interregnum, criminals like Vyacheslav Leontyev built empires. The collapse of Soviet authority created opportunities that would never exist again, a brief window where everything was possible and nothing was forbidden. Post-Soviet Moscow in the early 1990s was a city transforming from communist control to wild capitalism overnight. State assets were being privatized in schemes that enriched insiders and created overnight billionaires. Banks appeared from nowhere, offering impossible interest rates before collapsing and stealing depositors' money. Every industry, from oil to aluminum to real estate, was being carved up by former Soviet officials and criminal organizations, often working together. Vyacheslav's organization expanded dramatically during this period. He wasn't just trading goods anymore, he was providing protection, a euphemism for extortion, controlling markets, and muscling into legitimate businesses. The racket was simple. Businesses paid Vyacheslav's organization for security, and in return, they weren't robbed, destroyed, or driven out by competitors. Refused to pay, and problems appeared mysteriously. But Yaponets was smarter than typical racketeers. He didn't just shake down random businesses. He studied markets, identified profitable sectors, and systematically took control. He'd target entire industries in specific Moscow districts, creating monopolies that generated steady income. It was organized crime actually being organized, treating criminal enterprise like business rather than just violence and theft. His relationship with traditional Vori v. Zak I, thieves-in-law, was complicated. The old guard viewed new criminals like Vyacheslav with suspicion. They lacked traditional criminal upbringing, didn't follow old codes, and were too willing to work with former Soviet officials. But Vyacheslav was also too successful to be dismissed. He controlled territory, generated income, and commanded respect through results. The old criminals couldn't destroy him, so they had to acknowledge him. Vyacheslav's approach to violence was professional and strategic. He employed enforcers, violent men who handled physical intimidation and elimination, but Yaponets himself remained above direct violence. He ordered it, authorized it, and directed it, but he didn't personally pull triggers. This insulation protected him legally and maintained his mystique. Yaponets was the brain directing violence, not the fists implementing it. In the mid-1990s, Vyacheslav aligned himself with the Solntsevskaya Bratva, Moscow's most powerful criminal organization. Solntsevo controlled enormous operations, from drug trafficking to arms dealing to controlling businesses throughout Moscow and beyond. Aligning with them provided Vyacheslav protection, legitimacy within criminal hierarchy, and opportunities for larger operations than he could manage independently. But Vyacheslav wasn't just a subordinate. He was a partner with his own territory and operations. Solntsevo recognized his organizational abilities, his control of certain Moscow districts, and his value as an intelligent operator rather than just muscle. Yaponets brought skills that complemented Solntsevo's size and reach. He was detail-oriented, patient, and strategic in ways that larger organizations sometimes weren't. The relationship worked because Vyacheslav understood hierarchies and respected power while maintaining his independence. He'd defer to Solntsevo leadership on matters affecting the broader organization, but within his territory, he ruled absolutely. This balance, acknowledging superior power while maintaining autonomy, required diplomatic skills that many criminals lacked. Vyacheslav had those skills. His operations during this period expanded into new areas. Protection rackets remained foundational, but Vyacheslav also moved into more sophisticated crimes. Money laundering through businesses he controlled, skimming from construction projects, and taking percentages from various illegal markets. The diversity of income streams made his organization stable and resilient. If one operation faced pressure, others continued generating revenue. Vyacheslav also started cultivating relationships with legitimate business and government officials. Post-Soviet Russia was a place where criminal and legitimate power blurred completely. Successful businessmen employed criminal protection. Government officials partnered with criminal organizations. And criminals like Vyacheslav positioned themselves as bridges between underworld and legitimate society. This positioning made him valuable and more difficult to prosecute than obvious criminals. His reputation as Yaponets grew during this period. Stories circulated about his intelligence, his strategic thinking, and his ruthlessness when necessary. The mystique he'd cultivated, silent, mysterious, calculating, became his brand. People feared Yaponets not because he was the most violent criminal in Moscow, but because he was the most unpredictable. You couldn't read him, couldn't anticipate his moves, and couldn't assume he'd follow normal criminal logic. One of Vyacheslav's most profitable and dangerous operations was contract killing, providing professional assassination services for clients who needed problems eliminated. Post-Soviet Russia had enormous demand for the service. Business disputes settled through murder, competition eliminated, and witnesses silenced. Yaponets built an organization that provided these services efficiently and discreetly. The operation was sophisticated. Clients would approach through intermediaries, never dealing directly with Vyacheslav. The target would be researched, habits studied, security assessed, vulnerabilities identified. Methods would be chosen based on circumstances. Sometimes shootings, sometimes bombings, sometimes staged accidents. And execution would be professional, carried out by specialists who disappeared immediately after completing contracts. Vyacheslav's organization developed reputation for reliability. When Yaponets accepted a contract, the target died. This reliability was valuable in Moscow's chaotic criminal landscape where many assassination attempts failed. Clients knew that paying Vyacheslav's organization meant the job would be done correctly, cleanly, and without connection back to those who'd ordered the hit. The fees were substantial. Depending on target security and prominence, assassinations could cost tens of thousands of dollars or more. But clients paid because alternatives were worse. Attempting murder yourself risked exposure. Using unreliable killers meant potential failure. And failure in assassination attempts created enemies and legal problems. Vyacheslav's organization provided professional service that minimized risks. But this business also created enormous dangers. Every assassination created enemies. Families seeking revenge, police investigating murders, and rival criminals who might have preferred targets alive. Vyacheslav managed these risks through careful client selection, thorough planning, and maintaining distance between himself and actual killings. He was never at crime scenes, never directly involved, always insulated by layers of organization. The psychological detachment required to run an assassination business was remarkable. Vyacheslav treated murder like any other business service. Identify client needs, assess feasibility, quote prices, deliver results. The moral dimension of killing people for money apparently didn't trouble him. Whether this was sociopathy, cultural product of Soviet and post-Soviet violence, or just pragmatic compartmentalization is unclear. But Yaponets could order deaths with the same emotional detachment someone might use ordering office supplies. As Vyacheslav accumulated wealth through criminal operations, he followed the traditional path of successful criminals, investing in legitimate businesses. But in 1990s Russia, the distinction between legitimate and criminal business was often meaningless. Virtually every significant business had criminal connections, employed criminal protection, or engaged in practices that would be illegal in functional legal systems. Vyacheslav invested in various sectors: real estate development, restaurants and nightclubs, import-export companies, and various service businesses. These weren't just fronts for money laundering, though they served that purpose. They were actual businesses generating legitimate income. Yaponets understood that criminal income was unstable and risky, while legitimate business could provide sustainable wealth and social legitimacy. His approach to business was similar to his approach to crime: strategic, organized, and focused on long-term value rather than quick profits. He'd identify undervalued opportunities, invest systematically, and build businesses that could operate independently of his criminal activities. This diversification protected him. If criminal operations faced pressure, legitimate businesses continued generating income and providing cover. The restaurants and nightclubs Vyacheslav owned became gathering places for Moscow's emerging elite. Oligarchs, government officials, celebrities, and successful criminals mixing freely. These establishments provided Vyacheslav with networking opportunities, intelligence about what powerful people were doing, and legitimacy as a successful businessman rather than just a criminal. The social capital from owning popular venues was as valuable as the direct profits. Real estate was particularly lucrative. Moscow was transforming rapidly. Property values were exploding, and those who controlled valuable locations became enormously wealthy. Vyacheslav used both legitimate purchases and criminal methods, forcing competitors out, manipulating bureaucracy through corruption, to acquire properties that would increase dramatically in value. By the late 1990s, his real estate portfolio alone was worth millions. But legitimate business also created vulnerabilities. Businesses have records, employees, and paper trails that can be investigated. Vyacheslav had to balance the benefits of legitimate income against the risks of creating evidence that prosecutors could use. He managed this through complex ownership structures, using intermediaries and shell companies to obscure his control, and maintaining careful separation between legitimate businesses and obviously criminal operations. Vladimir Putin's rise to power in 1999 to 2000 changed Russian criminal landscape fundamentally. Putin brought a former KGB officer's mentality: the state should control everything, including criminals. The chaotic 1990s where criminals operated with near impunity would end. Criminals would either submit to state control or be destroyed. For Vyacheslav Leontyev, this meant difficult choices about how to navigate the new order. Putin's approach to organized crime wasn't elimination, it was subordination. Criminals who accepted state authority, who operated within limits set by security services, and who served state interests when required could continue operating. But criminals who challenged state power or refused to cooperate faced the full force of Russian law enforcement and intelligence services. The message was clear: you can be criminal, but the state is the ultimate authority. Vyacheslav, always strategic, recognized the new reality and adapted. He maintained his criminal operations but became more careful about challenging state interests. When security services needed cooperation, information about other criminals, assistance with operations, or simply staying out of certain situations, Vyacheslav provided it. This pragmatism kept him operational when more rigid criminals faced prosecution or worse. But the Putin era also meant increased competition. Security service officers and former KGB colleagues were themselves becoming involved in criminal enterprises, creating state-backed criminal groups that had advantages private criminals couldn't match. Vyacheslav had to compete with organizations that had government protection, military resources, and official impunity. It was a fundamentally unfair competition. His Saint-Cyvo connections became both asset and liability during this period. Saint-Cyvo was powerful enough to negotiate with the state rather than just submit, but that power also made them a target. Russian authorities wanted to demonstrate control over even the most powerful criminal organizations. Being associated with Saint-Cyvo meant benefiting from their strength but also sharing their exposure to state pressure. Vyacheslav's response was characteristic. He became quieter, more cautious, and more selective about operations. The flashy, visible criminality of the 1990s became dangerous in Putin's Russia. Criminals who sought publicity or flaunted their power faced state retaliation. Yaponets, who'd always preferred operating in shadows, adapted easily to this new environment. His natural inclination towards secrecy and discretion became valuable survival traits. Throughout the 2000s, Moscow's criminal underworld remained violent despite Putin's attempts to impose order. Different organizations fought over territory, markets, and control. These weren't the chaotic gang wars of the 1990s. They were more strategic conflicts between established organizations fighting for dominance. Vyacheslav Leontyev was both participant and target in these conflicts. The violence manifested in assassinations, bombings, and systematic intimidation campaigns. Competitors would be killed, their businesses destroyed, their associates terrorized into submission or cooperation. Vyacheslav both implemented these tactics and defended against them. His organization conducted hits against rivals while also protecting against attacks on himself and his operations. Car bombings became a preferred method, sophisticated, deadly, and difficult to prevent. Remote-controlled explosives attached to vehicles, detonated when targets entered their cars. Vyacheslav survived multiple attempts on his life through a combination of luck, security measures, and paranoia. He varied routines, used armored vehicles, and employed bodyguards extensively. The cost of security was enormous, but the cost of inadequate security was death. His reputation as Yaponets was both protection and target during these years. Protection because his reputation for strategic thinking and ruthless retaliation made attacking him seem risky. Target because successful criminals inevitably attracted rivals who wanted to eliminate competition or take over their operations. Vyacheslav lived in a permanent state of siege, knowing that at any moment, someone might attempt to kill him. The casualties among Moscow's criminal elite during this period were staggering. Leaders of major organizations were assassinated regularly. Some died in spectacular public killings meant to send messages. Others simply disappeared, their bodies never found. Vyacheslav attended funerals constantly, not out of genuine mourning, but because appearance at criminal funerals was expected and absences were noticed and interpreted. His survival through this period demonstrated both skill and luck. Skill in maintaining security, reading threats, and eliminating enemies preemptively. Luck in avoiding the random chance that kills even careful criminals. Being in the wrong place at wrong time, a security lapse at the wrong moment, or an attack too well planned to prevent. Vyacheslav survived where many didn't, and survival itself became part of his legend. As Moscow became more dangerous and competitive, Vyacheslav began expanding operations internationally. Russian criminal organizations were globalizing, establishing operations in Europe, United States, and other former Soviet republics. Yaponets followed this trend, building connections and operations beyond Russia's borders that diversified his income and provided escape routes if Moscow became untenable. His international operations focused on areas where Russian criminals had traditional advantages. Money laundering through European financial centers, particularly Cyprus and small European states with weak regulations. Drug trafficking routes between Central Asia and Europe. Arms trafficking taking advantage of poorly secured former Soviet weapon stockpiles. These operations generated substantial income and gave Vyacheslav international reach. But international expansion also meant dealing with non-Russian criminals and law enforcement agencies that were sometimes more effective than Russian ones. Vyacheslav had to establish relationships with Italian mafia, Eastern European criminal groups, and various other organizations. These relationships required diplomacy, compromise, and navigation of cultural differences that didn't exist when operating purely in Russia. Western law enforcement agencies, particularly FBI and Interpol, were also paying increasing attention to Russian organized crime. Vyacheslav appeared in various intelligence reports and watch lists, identified as significant figure in Russian criminal networks. This attention created risks. International travel became dangerous. Foreign bank accounts were vulnerable to seizure, and operations outside Russia faced prosecution risks that were harder to corrupt away than in Russia. His strategic response was creating multiple identities and using intermediaries for international operations. Vyacheslav rarely traveled personally, instead sending trusted associates who managed overseas operations on his behalf. Money was moved through complex networks of shell companies and offshore accounts that obscured ultimate ownership. The international operations were profitable but were managed to minimize Vyacheslav's direct exposure. The globalization also demonstrated how far Russian organized crime had evolved since Soviet collapse. From operating in Moscow's informal markets to conducting international operations worth millions, the transformation was complete. Vyacheslav embodied this evolution. From young hustler in late Soviet shadow economy to international criminal managing operations across continents. By the 2010s, Vyacheslav Leontyev led an increasingly schizophrenic existence. Publicly, he was a successful businessman, owner of restaurants, real estate investor, and entrepreneur. Privately, he remained Yaponets, criminal boss controlling operations worth tens of millions, ordering violence when necessary, and maintaining position in Moscow's hierarchical underworld. This dual existence required constant management. His legitimate businesses had to actually function and generate profits, providing plausible explanation for his wealth. His criminal operations had to be insulated from legitimate activities, preventing prosecution from contaminating legal enterprises. And he personally had to present as legitimate businessman while maintaining authority over criminal organization. Different personas for different audiences. The psychological compartmentalization this required was extraordinary. Vyacheslav would attend business meetings discussing legitimate development projects, then hours later authorize violent retaliation against competitors. He'd socialize with Moscow's elite at his nightclubs, knowing some attendees were aware of his criminal background but politely ignoring it. Russian society's acceptance of blurred lines between criminal and legitimate made this duality possible. His family life was also complicated by this duality. Vyacheslav had married, had children, and wanted to provide them normal lives separate from his criminal activities. But how do you keep family separate when you're one of Moscow's most notorious criminals? How do you ensure children don't learn about their father's real business? The answer was probably incomplete separation. Family members likely knew generally what Vyacheslav did while being protected from specific details. Social status in Moscow's elite circles was another complication. Vyacheslav's wealth gave him access to high society, but his criminal reputation created barriers. Some legitimate businesspeople and officials wouldn't associate with known criminals, while others specifically sought connections with powerful underworld figures. Vyacheslav had to navigate these social dynamics carefully, cultivating relationships that benefited his interests while avoiding associations that created risks. The stress of maintaining this double life was undoubtedly enormous. Constant vigilance about security, managing two separate organizational structures, compartmentalizing violence from legitimate business, and projecting different personas to different audiences. It required psychological strength and discipline that most people lack. But Vyacheslav had been training for this his entire life, learning from childhood how to navigate between official and real Russias. Throughout the 2010s, Russian law enforcement agencies conducted various investigations into Vyacheslav Leontyev's activities. These weren't sustained efforts to destroy him. Russian authorities were more interested in controlling him than eliminating him, but they created pressure and required careful navigation to avoid prosecution. The investigations focused on specific crimes where evidence was strong enough to support charges: money laundering through his businesses, tax evasion on unreported income, and occasional murder investigations where witnesses or evidence connected to Vyacheslav's organization. None individually threatened to destroy him, but cumulatively they created legal vulnerability that could be exploited if authorities decided to target him seriously. Vyacheslav's defense was multifaceted. Expensive lawyers who could navigate Russian legal system's corruption and exploit its weaknesses. Relationships with law enforcement officials who could provide warnings about investigations and sometimes obstruct them. Complex financial structures that made proving illegal income difficult. And when necessary, intimidation of witnesses or destruction of evidence. Russian criminal justice system's flexibility meant money and connections could often overcome evidence. But some investigations couldn't be corrupted away entirely. Western law enforcement agencies sharing intelligence with Russian counterparts created pressure that domestic criminals couldn't easily deflect. International money laundering investigations frozen assets outside Russia that Vyacheslav couldn't access through normal corrupt channels. The globalization that had benefited his criminal operations also created vulnerabilities he couldn't fully control. His response was characteristic: reduce exposure, compartmentalize operations further, and shift more assets into forms difficult to seize. Less direct involvement in criminal operations, more layers between himself and actual crimes, and gradual transition toward more legitimate income streams that were defensible legally. Vyacheslav was slowly evolving from active criminal boss toward semi-retired elder statesman who maintained influence without direct operational involvement. The investigations also demonstrated how Russian law enforcement served state interests rather than pure justice. When authorities wanted to pressure Vyacheslav, perhaps because he'd refused some cooperation request or because political factors made targeting him useful, investigations would intensify. When he was cooperative or when authorities had other priorities, investigations would languish. Law was a tool of state power, applied selectively based on political calculations. Over decades, the legend of Yaponets grew to almost mythological proportions in Moscow's underworld. Stories circulated about his intelligence, his ruthlessness, and his seeming invulnerability. Some stories were true, some exaggerated, and some completely fabricated. But separating truth from myth became impossible, and Vyacheslav encouraged that blurring because mystery enhanced his power. The mythology portrayed Yaponets as nearly supernatural in his abilities. He supposedly could read people perfectly, anticipating their moves and outmaneuvering them before they acted. He never forgot an insult or betrayal, tracking enemies for years before taking revenge. He'd survived countless assassination attempts through some combination of paranoia and sixth sense about danger. These stories made him seem less like a person and more like a force of nature. The reality was probably more mundane but still impressive. Vyacheslav was intelligent and strategic, but not superhuman. He'd survived partly through skill and partly through luck. He'd maintained power through violence, cunning, and adaptation, not through magical abilities. But in criminal underworld where reputation is power, the myth was as valuable as reality. Perhaps more valuable. His Asian appearance contributed to the mythology. Stereotypes about Asian inscrutability, discipline, and strategic thinking became projected onto Vyacheslav. He supposedly operated like a martial arts master or criminal strategist from Asian cinema. Patient, disciplined, striking decisively when moment was perfect. Whether Vyacheslav actually embodied these traits or just benefited from stereotypes is unclear. But he certainly didn't discourage the associations. The silence that had always characterized Yaponets also fed the legend. He rarely gave interviews, didn't seek publicity, and maintained almost complete privacy about his personal life. This absence of information allowed imagination to fill gaps, creating a figure who was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. Omnipresent in underworld but invisible to outside observers. The less people knew about real Vyacheslav, the more they imagined about mythological Yaponets. But mythology had limits. It couldn't stop bullets or prevent prosecution. It couldn't protect against betrayal by associates who decided cooperation with authorities was preferable to loyalty. And it couldn't prevent the simple biological fact that Vyacheslav was aging, his reflexes slowing, his ability to manage complex operations declining. The legend might be eternal, but the man was mortal. By the late 2010s, the world Vyacheslav had mastered was changing in ways that threatened his continued dominance. Technology was transforming both criminal operations and law enforcement's ability to investigate them. Digital surveillance made maintaining secrecy harder. Financial transparency laws made money laundering more difficult. And younger criminals were using methods and technologies that Vyacheslav, now in his 50s, struggled to fully understand. Cryptocurrency and dark web markets were creating new criminal opportunities and challenges. Younger criminals were conducting operations entirely online, using encryption and anonymity tools that made traditional investigative methods less effective. But these same technologies created traces that sophisticated law enforcement could exploit. Vyacheslav tried to adapt, employing younger tech-savvy associates, but his understanding was necessarily limited. Social media also changed criminal landscape in fundamental ways. The old code of silence was breaking down as younger criminals posted about their activities online, creating evidence and attracting attention that previous generations would have considered suicidal. Vyacheslav watched with horror as criminals essentially built prosecution cases against themselves through Instagram posts and messaging apps that weren't as secure as users believed. Geopolitical changes also affected Russian organized crime. International sanctions against Russia in response to Ukraine conflict made moving money internationally more difficult. Western countries were scrutinizing Russian financial flows more carefully. The relatively easy international operations of the 2000s became complicated by political tensions and enhanced enforcement. Vyacheslav's international operations faced pressures they hadn't experienced previously. Most significantly, The generation of criminals who'd built empires in 1990s chaos was aging out. Deaths, imprisonments, and retirements were thinning their ranks. Younger criminals had different values, different methods, and less respect for traditional hierarchies. The world Vyacheslav had known, where reputation and connections mattered supremely, was being replaced by something flatter, faster, and more chaotic. His response was gradual withdrawal from operational leadership while maintaining strategic influence. More decisions delegated to younger associates, more operations conducted without his direct involvement, and gradual transition from active boss to elder advisor. It was practical recognition that the world had changed, and continuing to operate like it was still the 1990s was path to destruction. Vyacheslav Leontyev, Yaponets, remains alive in Moscow in his early 60s, still influential in criminal underworld but no longer the active boss he once was. He survived longer than most criminals from his generation, outliving many contemporaries who died violently or languish in prison. His survival is itself remarkable, demonstrating that intelligence and adaptation matter more than just violence and bravado. His current life is probably less dramatic than his peak years. More time spent managing legitimate businesses and investments, less involved in day-to-day criminal operations. The restaurants and real estate portfolio provide substantial income without the risks of active criminality. But he maintains connections and influence, consulted by younger criminals who respect his experience and fear his residual power. Security remains paramount. Vyacheslav still lives with bodyguards, armored vehicles, and constant vigilance against potential attacks. Old enemies don't forget, and in Russian criminal world, revenge can wait decades before being served. Every public appearance is calculated risk, every meeting potential ambush. The paranoia that kept him alive for decades remains necessary even in semi-retirement. His family has presumably grown. Children now adults, perhaps grandchildren. Whether they've pursued legitimate lives separate from his criminal past or been drawn into the family business is unknown. Vyacheslav has probably tried to shield them from criminal activities while knowing that his reputation inevitably affects them. Being Yaponets' child creates both opportunities and dangers they'll carry their entire lives. Financially, he's likely very wealthy. Decades of criminal income, invested wisely in legitimate assets, has presumably created substantial wealth that appears completely legal. Real estate appreciation alone probably made him tens of millions. He's achieved what many criminals dream of, converting criminal profits into legitimate wealth that can be passed to family without criminal taint. But he also carries the psychological weight of his past. Countless murders ordered, lives destroyed, violence perpetrated over decades. Whether Vyacheslav feels remorse is unknown. Criminal psychology varies widely, and some criminals genuinely don't feel guilt while others are consumed by it. But even without remorse, the stress of decades living under threat of death or imprisonment leaves psychological scars. Vyacheslav Leontyev represents a specific moment in Russian history. The chaotic transition from Soviet Union to post-Soviet Russia, where traditional order collapsed and new order hadn't yet been established. In that interregnum, criminals like Yaponets built empires that would have been impossible in either functioning Soviet state or stable modern Russia. He was product of chaos, thriving in an environment that rewarded intelligence, violence, and absolute ruthlessness. For Moscow's criminal history, Yaponets is significant as example of successful adaptation. He navigated Soviet collapse, criminal wars of the 1990s, Putin's reassertion of state control, and technological changes of 21st century. Where less adaptable criminals were killed or imprisoned, Vyacheslav evolved, changing methods while maintaining core identity. His survival demonstrates that criminal success requires more than just violence. It requires intelligence and adaptability. For understanding Russian organized crime's evolution, Vyacheslav's career provides case study. From informal economy of late Soviet period to protection rackets of early 1990s to sophisticated international operations of 2000s, his trajectory mirrors broader development of Russian criminality. The transformation from small-time hustler to international criminal boss reflects how Russian organized crime globalized and professionalized. The nickname Yaponets itself became part of Russian criminal folklore, symbol of the mysterious, calculating criminal who succeeds through intelligence rather than just brute force. Whether real Vyacheslav Leontyev matched this image or just benefited from it, The archetype he represented influenced how subsequent generations thought about criminal success. Being smart and strategic, the legend suggested, was more sustainable than being violent and flashy. For law enforcement, Vyacheslav represents the difficulty of prosecuting sophisticated criminals in corrupt systems. Despite decades of known criminal activity, he's apparently avoided serious prison time, maintaining freedom through combination of legal maneuvering, corruption, and careful operation. His survival demonstrates that in systems where law is tool of power rather than principle, well-connected criminals can operate indefinitely. The ultimate irony is that Vyacheslav Leontyev, a man who built his career on violence and criminality, has apparently achieved what legitimate businesspeople pursue: wealth, security, and ability to enjoy success in relative peace. The criminal who should have died young or in prison is instead alive and comfortable, having converted criminal success into legitimate appearance. Whether that represents failure of justice or success of intelligence depends on perspective. They called him Yaponets, the Japanese, and he became a ghost who walked through Moscow's criminal underworld for 4 decades, always silent, always calculating, always surviving when others died. Born in Brezhnev's stagnation, rising through Soviet collapse, building empire in the chaos of the 1990s, adapting to Putin's order, and somehow still alive in his 60s when most of his generation is dead or imprisoned, Vyacheslav Leontyev proved that in Russia's criminal world, the quiet ones last longest, that intelligence beats violence, and that the most dangerous criminal isn't the one who shouts, it's the one who whispers and watches while everyone else destroys each other. The Japanese ghost survived by never being fully visible, never being completely knowable, and never forgetting that in Moscow's underworld, today's ally is tomorrow's corpse. He built his legend on silence, maintained his power through mystery, and conquered a city by making people fear what they couldn't understand.